This is Into Healing, and I'm your host, Mira Adura. Today's Into Healing guest is Jamie Mustard. Jamie is a writer, artist, trained economist, and co-author of the book The Invisible Machine. Having broken free from poverty and created a highly successful career, Jamie realized that none of these accomplishments gave him the relief he craved. In our conversation, Jamie connects his personal healing journey with his mission to invite trauma-injured people to try the dual system reset technique detailed in his book. His passion lies in advocating for trauma's biological origins so we can not only treat people medically, but also be more compassionate through the healing process. If you enjoyed this episode, please like, subscribe, and follow us for more transformational healing stories.
Jamie, thank you for coming and having this conversation with me.
Thank you for having me. I have no idea what we're going to talk about, but somehow I'm strangely looking forward to it.
I'm very grateful to be sitting here with you. I'd like to start at the beginning and just hear about how you grew up.
It's kind of a sad story. And again, I'm somebody that's worked really hard to kind of not live in reaction to my past. Mm-hmm. And there's, moral reasons for that. I kind of feel like there were a lot of negative forces that kind of ended me up in my situation because I shouldn't have been in it. And part of trying to not live in reaction to it for me is if I become what those forces should have turned me into, then those forces win. So it's very important to me to make sure that I live a kind of solar creative existence that's based on inspiration and not in reaction. I haven't always done it. I still fail to do it, but it is kind of how I approach whatever I do. So I'll share with you. It's not something I share the full scope of very often. But I want to just put that caveat there. What I don't want is for people to feel sorry for me, right? My parents were hippies, and from decent families, and made really, really bad choices. When I was born and raised in slums, and in and out of institutional environments. So at birth, separated from my mother, and grown up with, in an institutional, first couple of years of my life, in an institutional environment where people didn't care very much. Probably the most profound thing, God, you're really good at this. I'm getting, so you're making me emotional. Normally I'm pretty cool. But there's effects from that I wonder about, right? So the biggest one being human touch, just not getting human touch for the first couple of years of your life. That's, if you look at the animal kingdom and human beings really up until about 300 years ago, while we were still an agrarian culture, we were like all other kind of like primates. We would touch babies about 85 to 90% of the time for the first 2 years of life. And human beings were just like that until 300 years ago. And now that's fallen to maybe 10 to 15% for a regular child. So I wonder what the effects of that, are on, a person. And then, it didn't get much better from there. I struggled not being in school very much. I struggled with literacy into my late teens. And, was very fortunate that I was given some opportunities to improve my life, and didn't always take those opportunities, but at some point I got desperate enough that I took the opportunity. Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what your healing journey has been like?
I think, my healing journey has been one of self-deception and dishonesty. I'm somebody that, growing up in slums, violent neighborhood, lack of parents, there's a lot of addiction and abuse and all sorts of things in my,
Environment.
in my environment, in the surrounding neighborhoods. And growing up with that mentality in a place like that, probably the worst thing that you could be is a victim. So this idea that I was victimized or a victim, or that I'd been traumatized or hurt, that was not something I was willing to accept. And it really wasn't until about 6 years ago where I had gotten some, to a level of success that I was kind of willing to look back. And so part of that was getting to that level of success that was probably impossible, and then not feeling better, maybe feeling worse. And that was a little disturbing for me, because part of driving yourself towards being successful, at least for me, was to get away. To me, I looked at kind of, illiteracy and poverty meant pain. So the equation I made in my head was education and affluence means joy. And that turned out not to be the case. But that's what drove me. And so, about 6 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, I looked back. I went to therapy for the first time in my life. And I probably was 6 weeks in, and this lovely woman told me she had to diagnose me. And I was uncomfortable with it. I thought, what are you talking about? I don't need a diagnosis. I'm fine. We're just here talking. I never agreed to a diagnosis, right? And then she said, well, no, that's my job. And so and there is one. So I'm going to give it to you. And I said, okay. And she said, you have acute post-traumatic stress disorder. And I laughed in her face. Thought it was a ridiculous statement. And
because you're like, I'm successful. I'm all these things.
I overcame all that stuff. What are you talking about? And this lovely human, she kind of looked at me, and her eyes were kind of wet, like in just disbelief. And she said, have you been listening to the stories you told me? How could you not? And in that kind of moment, you and I were talking earlier about how you had a transformational hearing experience. Well, that was a big moment for me. In that moment, it just hit me that I was lying to myself. And then over the coming weeks, I went home that day. It started right away, and I just started hugging the cactus. I started going, no, okay, you were victimized. You've been abused, traumatized. You are damaged, right? Massively, massively damaged. I just started, the look on that therapist's face just brought the whole thing down. Yeah. And so at that point, I started looking. Now that I'm looking at this, what am I going to do about it? And what does it mean? Am I supposed to go to counseling? Am I supposed to
the bottom just fell out.
Yeah, am I supposed to do, am I supposed to do psilocybin? Am I supposed to start, smoking weed? What am I going to do? At that time, right around that time, I was friends with a military doctor who is a really well-known doctor among special forces in the military, named Doc Springer, Shauna Springer. And
how were you friends with her?
We shared a literary agent.
Oh.
Yeah. And I started kind of talking to her as my pal. I was helping her with branding stuff. And she had just quit TAPS after 15 years and was working for this place called Stellate Center, where they were doing this radical kind of new, it's not really new, but it was new to me. I'd never heard of it. Post-traumatic stress treatment. So it was very providential what happened. So she was telling me about that. And there was something that I'd always thought of trauma or mental illness as mental, right? But now that I was kind of faced with this issue for myself, or for the first time looking at it, this idea that there was a physical component to it, even though I'd never thought about it my entire life, was compelling to me. And so this doctor, who was a fan of my kind of previous kind of art design business book, reached out to me and said, "Hey, can we have a phone conversation? I'd like you to come to LA and speak to kids," or something like. It was really. He reached out to me on the website. It was random, and hey, yeah, sure, let's do a call. And it turns out this guy is probably the most accredited, bona fide, in terms of degrees and board certifications, bona fide forensic psychiatrist in the United States, neuroscientist. And I was leery of him. I'm leery of, psychotropics. It was not something I was ever interested in. But we did a call, and he worked for Daniel Amen and ran the Amen clinic in Encino, the LA clinic for Amen. His name is Dr. John J. Faber. Turned out that he had formerly been ran the entire behavioral health division for Humana, which I didn't know. And we became friends. We just completely just pure friends. And so when Doc Springer had told me about this kind of biological treatment for post-traumatic stress, I knew this guy. And I called him up and I said, hey, have you ever heard of this thing? And, he's a guy that focuses on mental wellness through brain health, either traumatic brain injury or brain toxicity from drugs and alcohol. And he said, well, I've heard of it, but I know nothing about it. And because he's really focused on the brain, and this thing involved the nervous system. And I said, hey, can you vet it for me? And and then he did this very kind of cool vetting process where he sent me some articles, and he said, really, the way you weigh something like this, what is the upside? What is the downside? How invasive is it? If, map out that equation for yourself. And if it's all up and there's little down, it's not very, and it's not dangerous, then what do you have to lose? And that's where so 2 years ago, well, maybe 2.5 years ago at this point. No, maybe 2.5 years ago, I braved COVID. And again, when you grow up like me, completely abandoned and kind of neglected by your parents, going to the doctor is not something you normally do. So in the middle of COVID, I got on a plane to Chicago to do this kind of radical, what at the time I thought was like a Vanilla Sky type experience. So yeah, that's how it started.
I just want to back up a little bit. You mentioned kind of the whole, growing up in poverty, the way you did meant like misery and, just not being in a good place, and how affluence and education meant joy. Can you just speak a little bit to, I know you mentioned to me earlier how you ended up getting from that to, you ended up going to LSC. The jump, how did that happen?
It's a great story. I was 16, we'd moved to Eugene for a few years from basically urban Los Angeles, and we were moving back to Los Angeles. I'd been there for 3 or 4 years. I had a relative in New York, right outside New York City, who called me and said, I want to fly to New York to talk to you about something. I trusted this relative, so I went. It was like on my way back to LA, right?
At 16.
At 16. So I go to New York and we go out to this beautiful house in Westchester County where this woman lives. And she made me this really unbelievable offer. She said, I know you've had a hard time of it. I know you're struggling with literacy. I know you haven't been in school. I was like an F student if I went to class, because I needed glass. I mean, I was so under-resourced. It was like walking around inside a deprivation chamber. I could read at a high level, but my ability to express myself through language or math the last thing I would have ever thought I was ever going to be in my life is a writer, okay? Because I was just so far behind in that area. And she basically said, listen, I want to help you. And I'm going to make you an offer to come live here. And rent will be, you have to be in school. Any kind of school. You can go to plumbing school, beauty school, trade school, any kind of school, and all your expenses and bills. I'll take you clothes shopping. You'll have medical insurance. She offered me all these things, okay? But I was so illiterate and just so disconnected and so broken at the time. I was an athlete, so maybe you wouldn't have seen it on me. But I just said no. Went back to Los Angeles. Can't do it. I couldn't do it. I was just, it was like, hey, want to come climb Mount Everest and I'll buy you dinner? That's kind of how it felt, right? So I was like, I'm not climbing Mount Everest. No way. So 3 years later, I really saw the only choice in life that I had was, I felt like I was staring down the barrel of a life of manual labor. And I'd grown up in Mexican neighborhoods where all people did was manual labor. And that didn't seem like a place where there was a lot of room for growth. So I called that relative up 3 years later, 19 years old. And I said, does the offer still stand? And she said, it does. And I said, send me a ticket.
I got just goosebumps.
Yeah. So it was a crazy story. It was like I never, first thing she did is like, okay, well, let's get you a physical. Let's take you and get your eyes checked. And it was all these things, right? And so I started doing remedial classes at a community college. And I went from remedial classes at a community college to graduating from LSE in just over 5 years. Crazy story.
It's amazing.
Yeah.
Ooh.
Yeah. And, it's actually kind of really germane to this conversation, that story, because at one point, I remember when, I was doing cool things, even though I was struggling with my literacy. It was like, I was starting to realize that I had this brain. In fact, it was probably making things worse for me because I had this mind with a busy mind with no ability to express. I like to say that I felt like Vince D'Onofrio in Men in Black. I was just like, just couldn't. I was just internally discombobulated by that. But I remember. So I did a special economic institute at Georgetown. I worked for an economist in D.C. Then I went to London. So I was accomplishing these kind of things that seemed kind of impossible. And I remember when we got the acceptance letter to LSE, and this relative turns to me and she's like looking at this thing. She's looking at me. She kind of knew, she'd seen the whole story of my life and said, how are you doing this? And at the time I said, I don't know. But what I was thinking was desperation. I'm desperate. What else am I going to do? Right? So it was purely desperate.
You got accepted.
I got accepted. And
so you had what it...
Yeah, it was like, it was a really, I don't know how I did. I still look back at that and I go, gosh, sometimes I feel like an escape artist, like that I'm just a genius at getting out of locks and chains in certain ways. But it was when I got there was the big kind of, I don't know, there was a big kind of letdown in a way, right? So remember this equation of ignorance and poverty, pain, education, affluence, joy. So I thought, well, I'm about to go to one of the most joyful places on earth. And I get there and I really felt like these kids that I was going to school with, who were the children of prime ministers and presidents and billionaires, and were more fucked up than where I'd come from. And it was very confusing to me. It was kind of like, okay, you motivated yourself to this impossible situation, get to this place, and the universe said, go fish. This is not it. And it wasn't really, until 2.5 decades later, when I met Dr. Eugene Lipov, that I understood what was going on. So that was I just was like, okay, well, this isn't it. And it was really disappointing to me at the time because, at least where I was coming from, there were these kind of very physical, real problems in front of you that gave you a reason to kind of be miserable. So you have all these people that have, they've been to the finest schools and they just tutor, they just had everything and they had classical educations and they played instruments and, they had all these things, and in certain ways they seemed, more miserable, or the ratio it seemed like more than where I was from. And so it was.
Why do you think that is?
Why do I think it is back then, or why did I think it is now?
No, back then.
I had no idea. I was just bummed. Yeah, I was like, I just said, I thought I would never know. I just thought I would never know. I kind of just thought, well, this is an unsolvable riddle. So I'm not going to think about it. And, and it was not good because I was judgmental. I thought, oh God, look at these guys. They've had everything handed to them and they're miserable and they have all this anxiety and depression. Depression. And people would say to me, sometimes in life, you hear that expression, trauma is trauma. And it would really piss me off, right? Because I would be like, really, trauma's trauma? Let's line yours up with mine. Okay? And we'll see if trauma's trauma. But then, I remember, I had a radio show on KXL years ago, and I interviewed a chess champion who'd grown up in one of the worst slums in all of Uganda called Katwe. Disney made a movie about her. The guy wrote a book, and then Disney turned it into a movie with Lupita Nyong'o and Charles Oluwayo about this girl who'd grown up. They didn't even really know how old she was because there's no birth records in this place. Monsoon, feces fills the streets during monsoon season. Her father had died of AIDS when she was 6, so she had to drop out of school because everything's fees. And then her sister died of disease. And this girl, when she was 9 years old, she walks into a sports ministry and she sees these chess pieces that are hand carved. And then 7 years later, she's a candidate master and wins the African National Championships, is one of the top chess players in the world. And so I interviewed her a couple times on the radio. Her and her coach her coach had become a friend of mine. And then I was like, okay, well, how, when talking to her, it was kind of like my situation felt like nothing, right? So I would get really offended when people would say trauma is trauma. I didn't believe it. That in the last 2 years, that point of view has radically changed. I now 100% know that trauma is trauma, and the judgment that I used to have towards traumatized people that maybe hadn't been through what I'd been through. I don't have that judgment, and I don't think like that anymore because of science and data that I've seen has convinced me that I was wrong. Yeah.
Let's get into it. Let's get into the science. So can you explain the difference between PTSD and PTSI?
Yes, PTSD is a myth. It doesn't exist. There's no such thing as PTSD. And that lie is a very dangerous, harmful, destructive, horrible lie in terms of what it reaps on the human being and the human condition. So what's actually going on is there's a thing called PTSD is actually PTSI, post-traumatic stress injury. There is no disorder. There's a biological change that occurs in the body that when one experiences prolonged allostatic load or chronic stress, or one has a very, very high level traumatic event. Typically we have a traumatic event, we slip or we almost, we catch ourselves or we almost crash our car, we get heightened. And then 5 hours later, we'll come back to baseline. Well, if that experience is too overwhelming, as in war or sexual assault, we can get stuck in fight or flight because there's been a biological change in our body, and you can see that on a brain scan. So for me, the idea that I'd had this notion of post-traumatic stress disorder my whole life, and I kind of would. I grew up around a lot of addicts. I judged them. Well, why didn't they have the mental fortitude or wherewithal that I had? I dealt with it. I pushed through it. Why can't you? I'm kind of ashamed of, having that point of view for 20 years, over maybe 30 years of my life. Because, now with seeing a tremendous amount of data, I couldn't have been more wrong. But, the best way to describe the difference between post-traumatic stress disorder, which is a myth, does not exist. There's a guy named Frank Ochberg. He's a very famous psychiatrist who was the guy that defined Stockholm Syndrome for the FBI in the 1970s. He, in 2012, has, with some other doctors, he's an old man now, he's probably in his mid-80s, has started trying to get the name changed from post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury. What's so interesting about that guy is in 1970, he wrote a book, it came out on Little Brown with a bunch of Stanford scientists. 1970, what's so interesting, 50 years ago. Yeah, and what's amazing about that book is it was 2 years after Dr. Martin Luther King was assassinated. And Coretta Scott King did the foreword to that book. What's interesting about that book, Violence in the Struggle for Existence, it's probably out of print, but you can get it on Amazon, a used copy. There's this chapter about biology and aggression. They say, these scientists are saying, we know 100% that trauma is biological. We're certain of it. And the reason we know is this. If you beat a goat, a chicken, a cat, a dog, a horse, if you beat an animal and terrorize an animal, it will change. If you abuse an animal, it will become one of two things: highly aggressive or incredibly timid, fight or flight. We don't think that animal is sentient. That animal does not now have a disorder. So we know that there's a biological change in the body from trauma because one for one, if you abuse an animal, it will go into either flight or fight as a chronic behavior, timidity or aggression. They just didn't know what it was. And then, 15 years ago, Dr. Ochberg, who wrote that book with these scientists, met Dr. Lipov, and he found what that mechanism was. But, kind of to go back to the London School of Economics story, you had all these kids. There were very few, there was nobody like me. There was a couple token working class kids from like East London with Cockney accents, maybe 2 or 3 of them. And that was it, but mostly it was a very privileged place. And what I've come to understand is that this trauma mechanism, this biological trauma mechanism, you don't need the physical trauma that I endured, poverty, you don't need all the kind of heavy stuff that I endured. That this system in the body is apathetic. It doesn't think. The nervous system doesn't think, right? So anything that triggers the nervous system or creates chronic stress on the nervous system changes our physiology, okay? You can get that, you can be the son of a billionaire. You can get that from distant parents. You can get that from lack of touch. You can get that from a mother that needles you, a father that doesn't hug you, from a divorce. And depending on our kind of epigenetic history, we're all triggered by anything that gives us chronic allostatic load, chronic stress differently. The symptoms are always basically the same. Trauma has to be biological if you think about it from a logic standpoint. We're a survival species. If a tiger, Peter Levine's work, if a tiger jumps out of the woods and is chasing us, and we all have a different reaction to it, then we don't survive as an evolutionary species. So there's about 8 or 9 symptoms that we see when someone has a biological change in their nervous system from trauma. Children, they take everything on. They think everything's their fault. So I now have come to understand 100% that trauma is trauma. The last 2.5, 3 years, I've completely transformed the way that I see the world. In addicts, growing up around addicts, I just had so much kind of like judgment towards addicts. And an addict, and this goes to Gabor Mate's work, is somebody that is trying to regulate their nervous system, right? That's all that is. Whenever you see an addict, don't see somebody that can't get it all together. See somebody that's been what you're seeing is somebody that's been so traumatized that they need outside help to
soothe themselves.
And
feel safe in their body.
Exactly. And some of and I don't personally see, one can do that with psychotropics, one can do that with cannabis, one can do that with alcohol, one can do that with cocaine, one can do that with sex. There's so many ways that one can do that.
Totally.
Right?
Surfing.
What?
Scrolling.
Yeah, wow.
You mentioned 8 or 9 symptoms. Can you just tell us what those symptoms are?
Yeah. I mean, can I tell a little bit of the story of how I came to those symptoms? Well, how I came to those symptoms is kind of fascinating. I got invited to speak at Fort Bragg for my first book and to Special Forces. And I was very leery of it. I didn't want to work for the military, quite honestly. I'm not a big fan of American foreign policy. I'm not a big fan of, I know what violence looks like up close. So I was not a fan of, killing people and helping the people that kill people, was kind of not something that I was very interested in.
I'm right there with you.
Okay. The colonels that invited me out, these Special Forces colonels, they said, well, we don't have writers out here very often. I was like, well, when's the last time you had somebody? Well, in 2016, we had Simon Sinek. And so then I was flattered. Okay, well, they're letting me follow Simon Sinek. That was just, so I came to, the conclusion, that these guys were good guys, that Special Forces has a very different mission than all of the other military. Their job is to kind of teach people to stand up to bullies. They train, so they train foreign troops to stand up for themselves. They go in where people are being oppressed. And so I was convinced, if you look at the Navy SEAL motto is something like, the only easier day was yesterday. It's very macho. The Special Forces motto is de oppresso liber, to free the oppressed. And I came to believe that these colonels were legitimate in their belief and intent and their actions. I went to Fort Bragg. And at this point, these colonels kind of found out that I knew this doctor, and they were doing this revelatory reset of the nervous system at WOMAC, which is the most advanced medical hospital in the world. They were doing it wrong, but they were doing it. So these colonels had never heard of it, yet they were running all of the training for all of Special Forces, these two colonels, Colonel Paul Tulin and Stuart Ferris, Lieutenant Colonel Paul Tulin and Stuart Ferris, and Colonel Stuart Ferris. But I did some PTSD meetings while I was there. And these guys were sharing their care with me, and they were all being told, this was 2.5 years ago. They were all being told that they had PTSD. So by the end of that meeting, I was furious because I just had to sit and listen for 2.5 hours. I mean, I just remember just boiling and just being disgusted. And at the end of the meeting, this guy named Jeff Dardia, who runs the Health Initiative Task Force at Fort Bragg, said to me, do you want to say anything? And I said, yeah. If I can be honest and say whatever I want. And then he said, you're our guest. We only want you to tell us what's on your mind. So you're going to end this meeting. So whatever you have to say is the end of the meeting. And I said, well, I was emotional and I got angry. And I said, listen, I just want to say everyone in this room, I want to give you a potent fact. None of you motherfuckers have PTSD. You have a biological injury to your body. You can go to Chicago and get it fixed in 2 days, get it reset. And I find it absolutely disgusting and absolutely inhumane that these people that are these Special Forces guys, when they come back from war, they sacrifice everything. Their bodies aren't the same. Their wives are getting secondary PTSD. Their children are getting secondary PTSD. These guys sacrifice everything. And for them to come back from that with their bodies broken, having lost friends, and they're being told you're crazy, you have a disorder, when they have a physical injury to their body, I just thought that was the most inhumane thing that one could imagine. And it surprised me. I expected Womack, which is the most advanced military hospital in the world at Fort Bragg, to know this and to be telling the truth. And so imagine if you had a broken leg and I said, you have broken leg disorder. Okay, how's your broken leg disorder doing? Snap out of your broken leg. Hey, I know you've been through a hard time. We wish you didn't have this like broken leg disorder, right? Because you can see a broken leg, you respect it. You can see post-traumatic stress injury on an fMRI, and I can explain that, right? So if you have the right scanner, it's just as real as a broken leg. So I expressed this frustration in the room, and everybody was kind of staring at me. And then that guy, Jeff Darty, kind of waved me over. And this was the kind of second, probably most profound moment in this kind of healing journey for me. I'm a healing journey. God, I sound like Little House on the Prairie. This guy, all of a sudden he's smiling and he says, hey, have a seat. Hey, you want to talk? And we're talking. And he said, have you ever heard of operator syndrome? So I've never heard of it. What is that? And he said, listen, there's a syndrome that these guys that come back from war get when even if they're never in a firefight, they're just deployed too long away from their families. There's IEDs. They're under chronic stress and threat of death for a long period of time. And he shows me the symptoms of operator syndrome, these 8 or 9 symptoms, which are the biological injury of trauma. And I'm looking at these symptoms in this kind of physical therapy building at Fort Bragg, and I don't see war soldiers. I see them in my neighborhood. My mind was spinning. I saw the neighborhood where I grew up. I remember I said, hold on to the guy. I called the doctor, the scientist that invented this sympathetic nervous system reset. And I said, do you know what operator syndrome is? He goes, I do. I said, that's an overactive sympathetic nervous system. And he said, I never thought about it, but I think you're right, it is. And so seeing that people coming back from war would have the exact same biological symptoms of someone growing up under the stress of poverty, that I had to know. I had to know. So about a little over a year and a half ago, I went with a film crew into a massive jail in the American South and interviewed murderers that had committed impulse murders when they were 19 or 20. And I wanted to know, does a guy that grows up in a neighborhood like me have the same symptoms as somebody coming back as a war hero, or somebody, they call him a hero, as somebody coming back from Afghanistan, right? And so that was kind of what that's what got me to start looking like, okay, how far does this biology thing go?
So we're going to get into the treatment, but just what are those 8 or 9 symptoms, just so we know? Okay, all right, let me see if I can do this. All right, so you have to look at trauma and the biological change it creates in the nervous system. Really what it does is it locks the nervous system into fight or flight. And I can explain the layman's version of that and the science version of what the science behind that is, okay? But you have to look at what that would be if you were living in the jungle 1,000 years ago and in South America, and a tiger comes out of nowhere, okay? You're gonna have about 8 or 9 symptoms, maybe 9 or 10 symptoms. You're gonna have 9 or 10 feelings that come from seeing that tiger, okay? You're gonna have a tremendous amount of anxiety, okay, about whether the tiger is about to eat you. You're going to have a hair trigger. Everything's gonna cause a reaction. You're gonna have a sense of doom that there's no way you're gonna be able to get away from that tiger. You're going to be hyper vigilant to survive the tiger. You're gonna be hyper aroused
all these people, like 25% of these special forces guys that come back from Afghanistan and Iraq have ED, because you can't have sex if you're running from a tiger. You're not going to be able to sleep. Who can sleep if a tiger is about to eat you? And you know, so and then in extreme cases in the military, where people are trained to protect, we're designed to live in that state of about to be eaten for about 90 seconds. Yeah. And then we're either supposed to kill the tiger
or get eaten
or get away.
Get away.
Okay. So in the military, so you have those symptoms: anxiety, sense of doom, mild paranoia, hypervigilance, hyperarousal, hair trigger, lack of sleep, which I've just described about 90% of all mental illnesses walking around in the world today. Okay. In the extreme cases in the military, where people are trained to protect, ultimate flight is suicide. In neighborhoods where I grew up, where violence has been a little more acceptable, ultimate fight is homicide. So what happens is when you have if you have too much of an overactive experience, like you see your buddy's head blown off in front of you, or a sexual assault, and you get into that heightened state, okay? If it's too heightened, not like swerving your car, but ultra heightened, that your nervous system gets stuck in fight or flight. So now 365 days a year, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you feel like there's a threat to your life. We're designed to live like that for 90 seconds. Yeah. So if you have to live like that all the time, watching TV, watching Netflix, scrolling through your phone, walking down the street, I don't care if you're a CEO or a plumber or a yoga teacher, you're either going to want to kill yourself at times, or you're going to want to kill someone. Because we're just not designed to live in fight or flight all the time. Yeah. But that is the biological change that comes from either extreme, overwhelming trauma. The biggest cohort that gets this in the world right now is the military. The second largest cohort that gets this treatment, the reset of the nervous system, is sexual assault victims. I think what the traumatic event is not the predominant cause of these symptoms, of the biological change in the body. I think what I've observed is that it's prolonged allostatic load, chronic stress. Yeah. If stress is a sense of heightenedness, okay? We're not designed to be stressed all the time, right? A lot of that has to do with how we move through the modern world, okay? Nature mitigates the nervous system. Anybody here can, if you drive into the gorge or you drive to the coast and you're there in nature, you feel yourself come down, okay? Well, we're going through whatever things we're dealing with in the modern world. In these artificial environments that are not part of our evolutionary biology. Again, you go back to, cities, what are we talking about? The first industrial revolution, 300 years ago, you had trains and coal and the transportation revolution, really, and coal revolution. That's what led to cities. But before that, people were in nature, okay? And 50,000 years and then 300 years it's a drop. It's a light switch, okay? So we live in an artificial box, and then we get into a roving artificial box to go to another artificial box where we work all day, and then we get back in the roving artificial box and come back to our artificial box, and we're not.
And we take breaks into the artificial box.
Yeah. I mean, that's new too, right? That's a whole other thing, right? Yeah. If you go and you see poor people. I mean, I asked Jeff Darty one time, this guy that runs the Health Initiative Task Force at Fort Bragg. I said to him, do you think people growing up in the inner city would have operator syndrome? And he said, yes. So then I said, does poverty cause operator syndrome? And he said, no. And I said, what do you mean? He said, well, I was deployed in Africa. When I go to rural communities, there's no problem. Yeah. They're in nature. They're not on their phones 24 hours a day. Okay, right? So what you have with lack of nature is you have this regulator of the nervous system that is removed from the human equation, right? And then one of the things that agitates stress in human beings, and you see this, You can see preteen suicide directly correlate with the rise of certain social apps on phones in 2012 is comparison culture. When you're living in a rural environment, maybe you're poor, but you're not thinking you're poor. You're thinking that you have enough to eat and you're living just a simple life. It's not necessarily poverty, right? I mean, Gabor Mate has a new book out called The Myth of Normal, where he talks about, where, it's like he says, if I were to create a society that would make us crazy, here we are, right? So, yeah.
You just mentioned kind of wanting to explain fight or flight both in layman's terms and in scientific. Like, obviously, there's some people watching this that are going to know more and some that are going to know less. So can you explain it in both of those ways?
Yeah, I'm going to do layman's terms first.
Perfect.
Which the doctor, my co-author, would hate. But I think it's the best way to tell the truth. Never let the facts get in the way of the truth, okay? It's the truth, okay? So layman's terms is this. You carry chronic allostatic load. I mean, one of the things I did in the last 2.5 years is I sent 8 to 10 of my wealthy white CEO friends to Chicago to get this treatment. They did not associate themselves with trauma. The first guy that I sent was the grandson of a billionaire that had all the symptoms. So I started testing this within my network and eventually just ended up, sending these friends of mine. So again, overwhelming traumatic experience or chronic stress for too long. The grandson of this famous billionaire, I won't say who it is, he was a working class guy that created this famous American brand. And he was kind of a misogynist probably. And he, treated women a certain way. He had one son and he kind of spoiled the son and was maybe, didn't treat women the same way. And the son became entitled and became a drug addict and was never really there for my friend. And then he dies young, leaving my friend without a father. So the stress of that, even though he had come from this ridiculous family, gave him these symptoms. The same way, and he had the same symptoms as somebody coming back from war. So one is the blunt force trauma of the sexual assault, or it's like an overwhelming trauma, gets you stuck in fight or flight. But then the chronic stress of this kid, of this friend of mine, or somebody that grows up with, when you're growing up in poverty, there's physical threats in the environment, there's food insecurity, there's addiction, it's just a weird place. And there's a lot of great things there too, which we should talk about. Community. But community, genius. I think it's like the greatest untapped pool of lost genius on the planet. When I see poverty, I don't see a bunch of desperate people that need our help. I see a waste of genius. But back to these symptoms. So the system either gets stuck by chronic stress, they call it allostatic load, which is extreme chronic stress for a long period of time, or blunt force trauma. So what happens is when you have chronic stress, you have that overwhelming trauma, your amygdala sends a signal to this gangle of nerves in our neck called the stellate ganglion. It's where our nervous system is, our sympathetic nervous system, excuse me. And if that gets chronically activated for too long or overwhelmingly activated, that thing that jerks us into action, or that thing that makes us feel stressed, when we go out of that stressful situation, we get out of poverty like I did, or we come back from war and we're sitting in Walmart. That system, if it's too overwhelming, it stays locked on fight or flight. And the signal basically reverses, telling us 365 days a year, 7 days a week, 24 hours a day that we're under threat. That is the layman's version. Okay, the scientific version is when that happens, you see some changes, but the biological changes that occurs is you get this extra secretion of what's called norepinephrine and NGF, nerve growth factor. And you get something where your stellate ganglion connects to your brain. You get this increase in nerve growth factor. So it causes what's called sprouting, a extra growth of nerves in your sympathetic nervous system. Those extra nerves are what's causing those 8 or 9 symptoms. That's what's keeping you in fight or flight. But, most people that I meet that have had, if they have this injury, it's a spectrum. They'll have it between 4 and 10 of those symptoms. I look at depression as a manifestation of those symptoms. People call depression a symptom. I've not observed that. If you have those other 8 or 9 things going on, you're going to be depressed. And that's the manifestation, not the symptom. Yeah.
Before we get into the treatment, so Gabor Mate talks about big T trauma and little T trauma. The little T trauma, like not being held as a kid, or a baby crying and not being kind of picked up.
Sure.
Can you speak to where the little T trauma kind of fits into this a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the little T trauma for a child creates a chronic heightenedness, the same way somebody that might hate their job. There's this expression I've heard the last couple of years, and maybe I felt it 25 years ago, but I feel like it's in the modern vernacular now, this concept of the Sunday scaries, right? Have you ever heard that expression?
Yeah, like going back to work on Monday.
Yeah. But just that idea that we have, that so many millions of people experience stress on a Sunday afternoon because they have to go back to work on Monday. What the fuck is that? The fact that we need a term for it. Okay? That's a little T. But if it's causing stress in your nervous system, something that's 24 hours a day, that's your routine that you're doing for 1/3 of your existence, that could be considered little T, but little T isn't really little T. It's kind of like our evolutionary biology is based on, for 50,000 years, is based on 85 to 90% human touch for the first 18 months to 2 years of life. So Sebastian Junger talks about that in his book, Tribe. So that's little T, not getting touched. But is it really little T? No, we have an evolutionary need for that. That's creating a stress on us. And then you start accumulating that from no one's paying attention to you, you're not getting your emotional needs met. One of the things that shocked me when I went to this jail and I was interviewing these murderers is, I think 2 of them said to me that they didn't get their emotional needs met as a child. And that was so shocking to me because I'd personally never thought about it. I'd never thought about that I even was allowed to have emotional needs. So the fact that these guys could articulate that was amazing to me. I think that those little things accumulate into a very, very distinct pressure, and that pressure keeps you heightened, because if you're not being touched, then where are your parents? What's happening? Have they been eaten? Okay, right. So is anyone ever going to touch me again? Because when you're a child, a day is like 5 months. Time is far, far, far slower. So that stress can overactivate the nervous system. Yeah.
Can you describe the treatment for PSI and how it works?
It's gone through an evolution over the last 20 years. But it was first invented, if we want to go way back, in 1926. It was a pain injection used to treat tingling hands. Yeah.
Like nerve?
Yeah. Huh. Nerve, hand sweats or people that would have tingling hands. They would give them this injection in their neck at their lower right C6 vertebra, and those tingling hands issues would be less.
Huh. And it's anesthesia.
It's a local anesthetic. Wears off in 20 minutes. This doctor, about 20 years ago, I think he published first on this in 2006.
This is what doctor?
Dr. Eugene Lipov.
Oh, okay.
Who's probably I would call him the Einstein of modern anesthesiology.
So from the 20s to 20 years ago.
It was just a pain shot for tingling hands. It was called the Stellate Ganglion block. When you say block, block just means a block of anesthesia. You take some anesthesia and you put it in an area, you blocked that area. That's all that means. Okay. About 20 years ago, he was doing research, Dr. Eugene Lepov, on women experiencing hot flashes, women going through menopause, and seeing if he could treat them. And his assumption was, okay, they use this shot for tingling hands, hand sweats. That's not so far away from hot flashes, right? So this nerve center, stellate ganglion, it runs from your amygdala really all the way down your body. I guess you could say the most important part of it is from your amygdala to your chest. So he was moving this injection around. I think he was even doing it in parts of the chest. And if I got this wrong, I'm sure he'll tell me. Okay, so he came up. He innovated this older shot and had staggeringly profound results with relieving women from hot flashes. During that time, a couple of these women came to him and said, my post-traumatic stress symptoms went away. And he was like, nah, can't be. You know, he just was like, thought it was strange, but it happened a few times. So he called his brother, was a physician, and he said, I think you're onto something. I think that you've found something. Let me send you, a PTSD patient, or really a PTSI patient. He published on it for the first time, I think, in 2006. Barack Obama endorsed it as far back as 2008. And now it's been featured everywhere. He's been on Rogan. It's been on 60 Minutes. It's been on CBS This Morning. This guy was a regular guest on the Doctor Show. It's been everywhere. The military is probably doing 15 to 20,000 of these a year. I make that assumption because when I went to Fort Bragg, they were doing about 3,000 a year at Fort Bragg alone. So it's been heavily studied by the military. It's become pretty mainstream. But the world is not aware of this. Yeah.
So what's the treatment exactly?
Okay, the treatment.
Okay,
so the treatment. Okay, so at first it was we know the shot is safe because it's been around for 100 years. And now, since they've had ultrasound, they've been using an ultrasound to do it. So now it's really safe. And he uses an ultrasound to guide a needle, and you get a local anesthetic, so you can't really feel it, to the stellate ganglion bundle of nerves in the neck. They were doing it at the lower C6. And he basically takes this $2 amount of anesthesia that goes into an epidural, and he shuts down. And I can explain the science of what's happening here too afterward. He turns off the sympathetic nervous system, almost like unplugging a computer. When it reboots 10 minutes later, it reboots at baseline. So that's what that's what he was doing up until about 10 years ago. Up until about...
And just on one side?
On one side, on the lower right. And up until about 7 to 10 years ago, that's how they did it. And that was about 70% effective in the relief of the most extreme symptoms of trauma. Okay. There's been some modifications in the last 7 years that have brought that to 85 to 90%. So rather than doing an injection at the C6, and again, I could have some of this science wrong, but I'm not far off. They do the injection at the C7 and the C3, a dual injection on one side, back to back. You can only do one side per day. And so,
why do they do that in two places?
Because it just seems to cover the area, the entire area. Like he was only getting part of it. So it was coming back or not as being as efficacious. And so the last 7 years it evolved. He did it on one guy and the guy didn't get better. So this is maybe 7 to 10 years ago. Then he to come back in and did it at the C3, and the guy had his life back. So that was like an innovation from 7 to 10 years ago. Then about 5 or 6 years ago, there's another ex-Navy SEAL doctor who does this, named Dr. Sean Mulvaney. Everybody was doing the dual. Dr. Lepov is the pioneer and inventor. We've now, him and Dr. Mulvaney would share notes. Dr. Mulvaney's been critical in this being studied and brought into the military. Dr. Mulvaney had a patient where he was dealing with somebody who had extreme childhood trauma as well as war trauma. Does this thing on him, the dual shot, because they all share their notes, or Mulvaney and Lipov do. And the person was just as horrible and miserable and bummed out. Mm-hmm. So he said, come back tomorrow. Person comes back, he does the left side. Mm. And here's what they found. They found that adult trauma, right side. Mm. Childhood trauma, anything before puberty, left side. They always do the right side first. And then you can only do one side per day. It takes about 15 minutes. So you can pretty much be trauma-free in a simple safe outpatient procedure done over 2 days, 15 minutes a day.
So interesting that the left side is the childhood, since it's the feminine.
Well, it was really interesting for me because I went, and got my right side done, and went to Portland, and then came back to Portland. And I felt better from it because I've had both, right? But I could feel it. Like 2 weeks after I got back to Portland, I could feel that side of my body. Like now that right was gone, I could feel that. I could feel it. It was like, and so I called the doc and I said, listen, I think I can feel that I have a problem on the left side. And he said, well, that's normally associated with childhood trauma. I said, listen, if you saw my intake form, like when I was writing down my intake form, I think I wrote too much. Like I broke down. Like I almost backed out because it was just writing down the story overwhelmed me emotionally. And I almost backed out of it. But I said, that's what I have primarily, And he said, well, I just want to do no harm. And I was like, well, okay, do no harm. Well, harm is me sitting with this in my body. Like, I feel like I can feel it. Are you telling me that I'm imagining it? And he said, no, there's pain or receptors there. I've not met somebody that can feel it, but you're weird. I feel like you can feel it. Mm. So I think if you say you can, I actually believe you. So a few weeks later, I went back to Chicago and did my left side. And that was the most transformational experience of my entire life. Mm. It was like my life started in a new way then. So when I went back and did my left side, which is my childhood side, that was the most transformational experience of my entire life. And I'm not a person that speaks in absolutes or hyperbole like that, but if you understand the science, and if you have now that I have an understanding of what that did to me, it makes total logical sense that I would feel that way. And one of the things that bums me out about it is you get inured. Once you kind of are back and you're back yourself again, and 6 months to a year go by, you can kind of think, oh, I always felt this good, and you can forget how you were before. Mm. And so I'm constantly reminding myself, I'll have a stressful experience and go, God, this is pressurizing. And then I'll remind myself, okay, well, how would you have reacted like this 3 years ago? Oh my gosh, my life is, like before anything would happen to me, I would, any sort of emotional or pressurizing situation, and I'm somebody that puts myself in pressurized situation. Like I deal with corporations and CEOs and like capital, angry, mean capitalists, and they, I'm just dealing. I feel like I deal with forces. You know this.
Oh, I know.
Okay,
I know.
Yeah, and so when I'm under whenever I would experience any bad news or some sort of triggering situation, before this, like, literally, it would feel like my body would be taken over. Mm. Like I would just, like this. So like I would just feel a sense of doom that would overtake my entire body. That is no longer in any part of my existence. Mm. You have even this book has been a saga. It's been a trauma zone. When I started on this book 2 years ago, The Invisible Machine, I kind of had this kind of like, well, this will be like a Michael Lewis book. He's like my nonfiction hero is Michael Lewis. So I was like, this is going to be my Michael Lewis book. I'm going to do social justice. I'm interested in criminal justice. Or I wasn't really interested in criminal justice, but I'm going to go and investigate that. And so, but I had a very detached view of it. And I did not realize I was entering a trauma zone. 6 months ago, last summer I interviewed a kid in Portland, a black kid who was going to start at OSU in September. It was probably the most nihilistic. He'd grown up at North Portland, but his mom and him were doing better. It was probably the most nihilistic interview I've ever done in my life. It was more nihilistic than the Rwandan genocide survivor that I interviewed. And this kid kept saying he was I guess 18 at the time, and he kept saying that he wasn't going to live. He didn't think he would live past his 21st birthday. He just had a very nihilistic approach, even though he was an A student and he was starting at OSU, Oregon State University. Back in January, he was murdered in Northeast Portland. He was shot to death, and that was where. I realized, like, I'd kind of been in denial on the fact that I'd entered a trauma zone, but because I knew the kid and I'm really friends with his mom, that was kind of overwhelming to me. Like, oh my God, what did I get myself into here? So there's, that's kind of strengthened my resolve to tell the truth. I could have I was trying to get him treated before he went off to OSU, and there was a delay in getting the funding I came this close. So to getting him treated before he went, and then I couldn't get him to go to Chicago after he'd started to school. So I had a bit of a moral injury on that one. Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's okay. I mean, it strengthened my resolve, in honor of him to tell the truth.
So I know you talked a little bit about who Jamie was before and after, but you talked about it a little bit more on a biological level. Who is Jamie before and after on an emotional level?
Such a fucking profound question. Oh my God. It makes me want to cry just like hearing it. And not tears of pain. Like, I wouldn't have been able to get through this interview before this. If I would start to go back, and this is somebody that completely denied they had trauma. If I would start to go back and excavate what happened to me as a child, like, I almost died like 3 or 4 times. Like, every year or two, I would get a reprieve and I would go stay with my grandmother in New York. She would fly us out there for the summer. And I think 3 times I had some life-threatening ailment, that was like emergency room stuff. One was straight to the emergency room. Another time was with my hearing. I had to get surgery the next morning in New York City. So total neglect that, I shouldn't be able to hear. I should have, there were things that probably, that no one was looking at me, right? So when I would start, even though I was in denial, if I ever rarely got into a situation where someone would ask me about that, what I would feel in my body talking about it would be like, I can't even describe it. The amount of overwhelming physical sensation of that I wouldn't even be able to talk. And what I'd be feeling internally, there are no words for just being so physically overwhelmed by emotional pain that I'm shutting down. I'm just shutting down. And maybe tears with no thought, right? So I denied trauma, and I did whatever I had to do to never talk about it. I can say that now. I wouldn't have said that then. But anxiety, through the roof. I didn't think of it anxiety. Look at everything I was accomplishing. It was I'd had it since birth. I didn't know that what that didn't feel like to have, okay? Sense of doom. I had such a powerful sense of doom that the other shoe was always going to drop that I would fucking create doom. I think a lot of people create doom in their lives because they constantly fucking feel it, so they make it. They make it on their children, they make it on their wives, they make it on their husbands. It is a major factor. I would create doom. Any sort of triggers, anything startling, like, just hypervigilance. Couldn't leave the house without checking the stove 15 fucking times. Okay? But I'm fine. Look at me. I got books. Famous people think I'm smart. I get paid a lot of money. I get paid a lot of money to go and talk in front of corporate people, make them feel good. Yeah, I was like, how much? For an hour? That's crazy. That's more than my parents made in a year, But movies were the primary way that my whole life have managed my sympathetic. Mm-hmm. When I was younger, I was very much afraid of drugs and alcohol because there was so much, I saw it just consuming people. Mm-hmm. And so I was just super repressed in that way. In the neighborhood, I wouldn't go near it. I was so hypervigilant, and I saw that as a way to, a hypervigilant. Like I can't, like before I walk into a room, if I walk into a room like this, I'm looking at escape routes. I'm looking at every single person. I'm assessing threat without even, unless you knew where I came from, you would see my eyes going like this on automatic. Okay. So, emotional me now. Oh gosh. I'll be talking to a friend and something emotional happened and I feel my body overwhelmed with joy, connection. Watching a movie and it's emotional and tears rolling down my face. When a tiger's about to eat you all the time, you're not going to cry watching a movie. Okay. Or, so what it does is, so for me, what it did is it took away the biological barrier to emotional connection. That's what I would say. Even though if you had asked me before I did this, if I was emotionally connected, I would have been, hell yeah, I'm so emotionally connected. But that would probably not have been very honest. Yeah, I was lying to myself. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you.
I hope that answers the question.
Yes,
okay.
Totally does. So how can people access this treatment, and how about people without the means?
One of the main reasons I did this is, I have a degree in economics and I'm an artist, right? So one of the reasons I decided that I would take this 2 years of my life off and just kind of like throw everything away was because about 3.5 years ago, the doctor that invented this, there was a guy, he is the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar private equity firm in Chicago. His name is Stephen Taslis. He heard about this. And he somehow got connected with the doctor, and he decided to open up clinics all over the world. So there's 35 clinics in the United States where you can get this now. Mm. And there's one in Israel and Australia, and they're opening more. There's only one place that has all of the modern protocols, and that is in this center. So I made a decision to go get this from the inventor. I almost backed out of it at one point, because it was just too traumatic. I almost didn't go. Doc Springer talked me from the ledge. And the way she talked me from the ledge, and you'll find this interesting, is I just said, I don't know if I can do this. It's just too emotional for me to get on a plane. It's COVID, everything was booked. And she was very smart because she knew that saw myself as a high performing person. And she said, Jamie, Olympic athletes do this. I was like, what? What are you talking about? She's like, well, like someone like Lindsey Vonn, they'll be in a skiing accident and their time will slow. And then they do this and then their time goes back to normal. And I go, come on. She's like, no, really, like the Olympians do this. So she reframed it for me as something that some elite person, an elite person could do. So that kind of got me back on the train, and then I went. Mm. Yeah.
So how do people who don't have the means access this?
The cost of this is actually pretty low. I mean, you can get this thing over 2 days for $2,000 to $3,000. I mean, if you amortize that compared to therapy,
Yeah, just
psychotropics. Yeah.
other
It's the
treatments.
cost is low.
I'm just thinking like people who really don't have the means.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's funny that you say that because there's a lot of scholarshiping going on right now with eraseptsdnow.org.
Okay.
And that's something I think a lot. When I first met the doctor, one of the first questions, he laid out the science for me, and that's a great story. But I asked him, what are you trying to do with this? What's your hope for this? Where do you want this to go? Where do you want this to be? Like, what's your dream? Like, if there's anything you could accomplish with this, what would it be? And his answer kind of surprised me. It kind of goes to the answer to your question, which he said, mercy ships. Mercy ships that travel the world and give this to anyone, whether or not they can afford it.
Wow. So this treatment's not a cure. How do you keep working on your emotional healing to maintain a healthier and more regulated state as life just keeps happening?
That is a great question. The editor at my publisher, who's one of the most prominent science and health publishers in the world, said to me at the beginning of the book journey, we had the big book meeting where we all sit around and we go, okay, well, what's this book about, right? And she said, the doctor, they were kind of looking to me, if the doctor's work is the invention, my work is, what does this mean in culture and society? That's what I'm bringing to it. So the editor kind of said, Jamie, what is this thing? What is this book? And I said, what do you want them to walk away with? I said, I don't even need people to believe in this. We could make a book so that anybody who reads it, we make it art. It is irrefutable after they read this book through science and narrative and argument that trauma is 100% biological. If we could get that understood en masse by culture in the zeitgeist, that just understanding that it's biological changes the world. Right? If you look at a book like Body Keeps the Score, it's completely changed culture.
Of course.
Like before that book, no one thought your body is taking a hit every time you get traumatized. Now we all understand that. And so what people have to understand is if the body keeps the score, the sympathetic nervous system is the scorekeeper. Okay? My goal if you can get people to understand that it's biological, then whenever you're dealing with something, when you're dealing with yourself, as you get heightened, as you heighten somebody else, if you have an awareness that if that goes on too long or is too intense or too increases over time, you're causing biological damage, we'll treat each other differently. Right? So just my biggest goal, more than even getting people to get the treatment, is like, let's all agree that trauma is biological, because it is. Yeah. Okay? And that to me, and then once you know that, then you can, when you start to get that heightened feeling, there's, again, I would recommend this, the Resilience Toolkit, Nkem Mfubo, I think her name is, if I'm getting it wrong, if you Google her, Resilience Toolkit, you'll get her. One of the common questions I get is, well, there's all these modalities out there. You've got everything from EMDR, RTM, cannabis, psilocybin, ayahuasca, equine therapy, petting ponies, right? Are all of these things equal in their therapeutic value? How does the dual sympathetic reset, the reset of the nervous system, relate to other modalities that exist, in the world? Is a huge part of what I tried to parse out and figure out in the book, The Invisible Machine. I was very lucky because I met this forensic neuroscientist, Dr. John J. Faber, who works with Daniel Amen. And he forced Daniel Amen and I into a phone conversation. And he is just one of the most beautiful human beings I've ever met in my life. And just, he became a tremendous partner and gave me kind of changed my understanding. I started, kind of helped me look at this thing in relation to all the other modalities, primarily traumatic brain injury or brain toxicity from drugs and alcohol. If you look at what the brain toxicity, you take a brain scan and say even a kind of simple surface scan like Amen uses, and you were to look at brain toxicity caused by drugs and alcohol. And 90% of the people in our criminal justice system have self-identify as having drug and alcohol problems. They call that brain toxicity. And you were to compare those brain scans to somebody coming back from Afghanistan that has brain damage from concussive war, traumatic brain injury, which is specifically, abrasions and damage to the brain. Those brain scans don't always look that different. One of the primary things you see, there's all sorts of, Eamon's been scanning brains for 30 years, but, which is a massive data set. So there's a lot of correlated abrasions and agitations in the brain that we see in behaviors. This agitates anything that's wrong with the sympathetic nervous system is going to be agitated by lack of brain health. I grew up in childhood poverty, okay? And so my nervous system is stuck in fight or flight. Everything is a threat. That cup of tea is a threat, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm a police officer. I pull people over all the time and stop crimes. I've had friends, I never know if that's going to be the person with a gun that tries to shoot me. I'm an innocent 19-year-old black kid that's doing my best to deal with the circumstances of growing up in poverty. I'm a police officer who's a good person trying to be a good police officer, okay? That kid is stuck in fight or flight. So this police officer, that threat is far more than just getting pulled over. Okay, than if I was in in a Mercedes in Lake Oswego as a white male, okay? That is a life or death experience for that kid because his nervous system is lying to the amygdala, telling him that this simple, innocuous situation is life or death. If you have two black kids that grew up in the neighborhoods I grew up in, and they get into a fight over a cheeseburger, the fight isn't over a cheeseburger. The nerves in their neck are lying to them, telling them that this fight over a cheeseburger is life or death. One goes to the morgue, the other one goes to prison for the rest of their life. But you take a police officer and a black kid, growing up in poverty, and that police officer has an overactive sympathetic because that's a chronically stressful job of life or death, right? And we have all these cultural things that we're putting on this situation, right? Systemic history and all that stuff. These don't necessarily solve the biology. Like to me, with any of all the things plaguing the world today, we should be solving the biology first, that should be the first thing we do before we deal with the institutions or while we're dealing with biology needs to come first. Let's relieve the suffering first. How about that? Okay. But they get, the police officer thinks that it's a traffic stop and somebody ends up, this ends up becoming a situation where someone is not killed. And, I'm not trying to justify anything for anyone. I'm talking about this is the biology going on in our culture and no one is talking about it. An overactive sympathetic nervous system is a pandemic that no one is talking about.
One of my intentions behind this platform is to introduce people to a lot of different modalities, because for me, I don't really care how you get into your healing journey. I just want to inspire people to get onto their healing journeys. So just knowing this treatment, how does that compare to other different, other treatments out there and how, I hate comparing because I feel like each one kind of does its thing, but maybe you can just give us some insight to how it's different.
Daniel Amen, who is, a famous psychiatrist, it's not like he doesn't prescribe drugs. He just prescribes drugs a lot less than most psychiatrists. Most psychiatrists probably prescribe drugs 100% of the time if you're getting to a psychiatrist. With Daniel, that's probably 10%. Okay? Why? If you ask Daniel would say, because when you give somebody a psychotropic drug, you're changing their brain. So you're creating a problem to solve a problem. And you haven't looked at their diet, you haven't looked at their health, you haven't looked at their brain health. What Daniel's finding is 90% of the time, when you have somebody that's if your arm acts weird or your leg acts weird, we x-ray it, right? But when someone acts crazy, we just put them on something. So Daniel's belief is no, let's look at their brain first. 90% of the time, what he's finding is that there's brain toxicity or brain TBI, and that when he remediates that, all of the mental what symptoms go away. In our first call, I said, I kept using the word mental illness. He kept getting a sour look on his face. I said, what's going on? He's like, please don't use that word. And I said, well, why? because it's a lie. It's stigmatizing and it's a lie. Well, what word do you want me to use? Brain health issues. Okay, let's do that. Okay, so I don't want you to poo-poo all the modalities, but there's science, and all the modalities are not the modality. Everything is not everything. And that's really, really important because this is life or death for people. I was at Fort Bragg one time and I was interviewing a psychologist. I talk about her in the book, named Carrie Elk, who had some really incredible healing practices for soldiers. I was very impressed by her. And she was very cynical about what I was doing. Me pushing the sympathetic nervous system reset. And she kept saying in the interview, like, Jamie, you're putting so much attention on the dual sympathetic reset. And, I mean, I don't know if we were calling it that, but, just like, like what you said, you can't poo-poo all these other modalities. Okay. And I said, Dr. Up, let me ask you a question. Okay. You have somebody that's traumatized and they've struggled. And there's this panoply of things they can do to heal themselves. What should they do first? We have the sympathetic, we have the sympathetic reset, the dual sympathetic reset. Anyone can get it anywhere in America now. Or they could go do EMDR, or they could go do RTM, or they could go do ayahuasca, or they could do, what should they do first? And she said, well, if someone's heavily traumatized and they're struggling, they should do the reset, right? The amount of gain, like I took a Delta Force guy who had led the mission that captured Saddam Hussein and survived Black Hawk Down. He was probably the worst case I'd ever seen, okay? The guy was electrified when I met him at Fort Bragg. We sent him to Chicago, scanned his brain and name clinic, did this procedure on him over 2 days. What the forensic neuroscientists saw in that brain scan, less than 48 hours after the first treatment, was astonishing. Something that you would see after 6 months of hyperbaric, being clean, and supplements, and ketamine, all done in less than a day or 2 days, right? So the way that I parse it apart in the book is, this is a broken leg you can't see. There's all these incredible therapies out there. They work. They're amazing. I'm a huge fan of, I've had friends tell me amazing things they've gotten from EMDR, from psilocybin, where we still don't have a lot of data, okay? From talk therapy, okay? There's just amazing innovation going on out there, and it works, right? But it's like doing physical therapy over a broken leg. We wouldn't do that. We would fix the broken leg first. Like if you look at a guy like Trevor Beeman, who you know about, yep. You've seen his story. He was a guy that Jeff Doherty had told me about him in that conversation I was talking about, seeing my neighborhood. He told me a lot of people that go into the military are go into special forces, which is extreme, or it's not uncommon that kids that are molested do that. And I said, why? Why would that be a theme? I thought it was so bizarre that he said it. And he said, well, because they don't want to be, they never want to be victimized again, and they want to stand up for people. It's not uncommon. We see it here. And I said, really, you know somebody like that? And he said, yeah. And I said, somebody that would go on camera? And he said, yeah. And he introduced me to Trevor.
Wow.
And Trevor had been living in a horror show for 30 years, homicidal towards his stepfather, suicidal. He had kids and wife. He was barely surviving. Shot up medical heroin in Afghanistan, killed people. I mean, we're talking about a high-level special forces operator. The military does not want crazy operators out there, right? So they put way more money. If you're Delta, Navy SEAL, Special Forces, there's an endless paycheck. They do not want you crazy. So, they'd spent $500,000 to $1 million probably trying to fix Trevor. You're not going to get that if you're a regular Army. One of the things that Trevor says is, he'd done EMDR, which he said almost killed him, but he felt like he got, something out of it. But, he did all these things. And when he went and got the dual sympathetic reset, he said, for the first time ever, those things kicked in. Oh. We set the leg, right? We set the leg. So if you can, say you have this much trauma, okay? And 30% of it can be fixed with therapeutics. things that are going to increase your resilience and give you some distance, from psilocybin to talk therapy to EMDR, right? Well, if you could get 70% of it taken care of in a day, how effective are you going to be with that 30%? Right? So I think it's really important not to collapse all those modalities, because some of those modalities damage us and are dangerous. I mean, I have a degree in economics, right? I don't have anything personal against the pharmaceutical companies. I do find it very strange. I think capitalist forces determining mental and physical health, the medical industrial complex, not just the psychotropics, those forces, our well-being, we would not put the EPA, we would not put Monsanto in charge of the EPA. We know not to do that, right? I have nothing against it. There's incredible things that the pharmaceutical companies do that improve our life, that make life worth living. They create the anesthetic that helps one reset the nervous system, right? So I'm not somebody that's down on the nervous system, but I do look at, or down on the pharmaceutical industry completely. But it's the second most profitable energy system, industry in the world, only to energy, and that says what it says, right? Yep. There's no motivator for systems change, right? So it's very important that every modality is not every modality. And that we look at these things individually. And Trevor, I've had friends that have had amazing, benefit from EMDR, but I've had people that I've talked to that have dealt with, that have been molested. I've not told me horror stories about being reactivated by EMDR, right? So I'm a fan of EMDR. Yeah. So I think it's really important to not just give credence to all the modalities equally, and to look at data.
Of course. Yeah. And you do your own research, and you come informed, and
I asked Gabor Mate in a conversation, what would it mean for the world if we could reset the nervous system? And he says it changes everything. Okay. So, and we can. So to me, reset your nervous system if possible. But even if you're, don't have the means to get it, by understanding that your biology is different, you're going to treat yourself differently. You can start mitigating against that in positive ways, yoga, nature, whatever, maybe not nature, but but first, just having an understanding that there's a biological problem in your body. When you feel a certain way, you're going to look at that feeling differently, because you're going to see it hopefully as biological.
Yeah, 100%. You told me when we first met that this book is for every person, no matter how ordinary our lives seem. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I've gone through various stages. If you look at, I think with the APA, if they gave the American Psychiatric Association, if they gave a number for amount of people that have been diagnosed with, post-traumatic stress in America, that number would probably be somewhere between 8 and 10%. I think that if you understand trauma as an overactive fight or flight system, stuck in fight or flight, that number hits 50% easy. If you just start adding up the numbers, okay, how many people deal with cancer? Okay, 10%. Well, there's no way you're going to be dealing with chemo and be at the end of it not have an overactive sympathetic nervous system. And how many women, 1 out of 4 women experience sexual assault? Well, that's 50 million people, right? So when you start adding up those numbers, I think you very quickly get to 50%. And then, I've kind of landed there, and then people are constantly correcting me going, it's more. And then how about that 50% of those people are dealing with the other 50%. So they're getting traumatized, right? So I think what Dr. Lipov has done is the most important medical innovation since the discovery of penicillin in 1928, and probably the most important human innovation since the moon landing. Yeah.
Cool. Why does healing our traumas matter in society and culture?
Oh my God. I think there's 2 binding factors of human existence. Okay. Love and trauma. And they can have the same effect on us depending on how we're affected by them. Love can drive us to become a CEO, a pop star, or to addiction and despair. Love can do that. Trauma hypervigilance, right? Hyperarousal. Trauma can drive us to become a CEO or a pop star or to addiction and despair. One of the, if you look at movies, I mean, 99% of all movies, what Steven Spielberg, the greatest filmmaker of all time, are about fight or flight. Someone's either running from something or fighting something, or it's about love. So I believe that it's everything, right? This is so primal and fundamental to our existence as human beings. It's what binds us, trauma and love. So it's everything.
So what does it matter to heal the trauma?
If we can heal the trauma, if we can see trauma as biological and we can reset it or remediate it, the amount of stigma it takes away. That's the thing about trauma that really, that'll keep me up at night, before, is that that gets under my skin. I try not to think about it, is the amount of people that are experiencing the effects of it, that if they just had an understanding that they weren't crazy and that it was in their body, you would take the stigma away, and what that would do for them right there would be so profound. So if we would look at criminal justice differently, we would reduce disease, we would improve marriages, we would improve children. I think even when we see environmental, the environmental disaster that is the world today, this tipping point that we may not be able to reverse, what is that driven by? Why can't we change our mind? Why can't we look at fossil fuels and go, oh no? Trauma locks us into our points of view. It stops us from seeing what's in front of our face. It drives us to greed. I think that it's everything. Yeah.
So if this treatment is one of the greatest discoveries of all time, and it's the broken leg that we can't see, why isn't everybody getting it?
Well, before I answer that question, let me say this. You told me at the beginning of this conversation, before we started the interview, you had this transformational journey. I think you're an incredibly smart person with an incredible ability to reach. There's no one that I would want to see get this and then go out to dinner with, okay? More than you. Because I feel like you've had so much healing, and what you were describing to me is really profound. But I'm saying this as a reset, right? So with everything that's happened to you for the positive, to be in that space and to see you get a reset and then go out to dinner with you, I want to record that conversation. Okay. But why does anyone not know about it? Well, first of all, when I started looking at Daniel Amen's data, and I was started to have this revelation that traumatic brain injury was a massive part of mental wellness or brain toxicity, brain health. I said, well, Daniel, if that's true, how come everybody doesn't know about it? Okay. And he screen shared this quote from a physicist from the 1940s, a guy named Max Planck. Basically, I'm paraphrasing, it says, medical innovation is won in funerals. You have to wait for your opponents to die. The people will not accept medical innovation. And I said, is that why you're so healthy? And he goes, yeah, I'm going to outlive them, right? But that goes to Semmelweis. Semmelweis was a guy in the late 19th century in Austria and Germany, a doctor, 1860s. And at that time, when a woman would give birth, that woman was 5 times more likely to die if she gave birth in a hospital versus birth at home. Okay? And they couldn't figure out why that was. Well, this guy Semmelweis had a theory. Okay? And Semmelweis's theory, at that time, they thought germs, 1860s, were spread by, and I could have the dates a little wrong, but I don't think I do, were spread by, they thought that infection was spread by odors, smells. So what was happening in the hospitals is a doctor would be births were always kind of done on the side. So doctors were in there doing surgeries, cutting up cadavers, operating. And then, oh, there's a birth. So they run over to the birth wing and deliver a baby real quick and go back. They didn't wash their hands because they didn't think, they had no germ theory. They thought it was all smells. Huh. Well, this guy, Semmelweis, he got it in his head that that it was doctors not washing their hands that was killing these mothers, and started writing papers across Germany and Austria and pushing for hand washing. Amazing. Okay, we got to wash our hands. Amazing. Okay, for his trouble, he was put into a mental institution where he was beaten to death 6 weeks later. 20 years later, I can't think of the name of the scientist that would prove germ theory. He was proven right 20 years later. You know, that is why it's so. Once you understand how the sympathetic nervous system works and it's biological, it makes so much sense. It's so simple. Okay, like hand wash. It's as simple as hand washing. Okay, medical innovation is one in funerals. So my idea, and I'd be real curious what you think of this as an artist, is, my view on it is that art is an amplifier, and it can permeate and create change and take time out of change. So by creating a book and using art, I can, rather than that taking another 30 years, we can put this into the zeitgeist in 3 years. That's my hope. Yeah.
Would you just read us a short passage from your book that you find particularly moving?
God, moving?
Moving or touching, or something that you wrote that you felt, just you'd like to share with us.
Yeah, I could talk to you about the first time I met Eugene Lipoff.
Okay,
because
great.
I was a patient. He came into the post-op, asked me a couple questions about why he was supposed to treat me like a VIP, and then left, and then came back and told me that the treatment would wear off in 7 or 8 hours and he could take me to dinner. I asked him in 20 years how many
patients he's taken to dinner?
And he said, 1, you. So that was a very unusual circumstance, right? And it was at that dinner that he basically laid out the science for me for 3 hours. And the section is in the book, The Invisible Machine, The Startling Truth About Trauma and the Scientific Breakthrough That Can Transform Your Life. And this is from a chapter called The Tiger and You, and a section called The Dinner Concludes. And it says, Jamie, me, we wrote this in the distant third person, Jamie, myself, had been listening intently to Eugene for almost 2 hours. The dinner conversation had been far from boring. Dr. Frank Ochberg was the first to call it PTSI, and I concur with his findings, said Eugene. The invisible machine overactivates. It's a biological event, and I can reset it. I grinned at him and said, and for that, I'm grateful.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie.
Thank you.
It's really such a treat to be able to sit here and have this conversation with you.
It's been intense. I didn't know what I was walking into.
If you enjoyed this conversation, please like, subscribe, and share with a friend. You can connect with Into Healing on TikTok and Instagram for more inspirational and behind-the-scenes content, and visit our website, intohealing.com, for transcripts and other goodies. Into Healing is made possible thanks to people like you. Contributions made through Venmo @IntoHealing or through our website, intohealing.com, help us bring you more inspiring episodes. This has been Into Healing with Mira Adura. Thank you for joining us.